For nearly 2 decades, a mathematical genius with delusions of single-handedly destroying industrial society planted or mailed powerful bombs to unsuspecting, innocent victims. It was a spree of mayhem that killed 3 and wounded over 24. In the largest and most expensive investigation in FBI history, agents spent 17 years hunting for the elusive terrorist known as the Unabomber.
The first bomb came in the spring of 1978. The damage it caused was minimal, but its impact would be enormous. With each new detonation, the bomber learned a little more about bombs, and law enforcement learned a little more about the man who sent them. Because its targets were universities and airlines, the FBI called him the Unabomber. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. Before we ever knew the name Ted Kaczynski, we knew we were dealing with a disgruntled genius. We just didn't know how smart or how angry he truly was, or how far he'd go. But while the Unabomber was carefully perfecting his bombs, we were refining our profile. It was all a matter of who would finish first.
On May 25th, 1978, an engineering professor named Buckley Christ at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, appeared in the mailroom with a shoebox-sized parcel. Professor Christ was listed as the return addressee, and he didn't know the man it was addressed to. Campus security guard Terry Marker cracked, "Maybe it's a bomb." As bombs go, it wasn't much of one. It began a 20-year streak of violence that would stump the FBI and terrorize the nation. On November 15th, 1979, American Airlines Flight 444 took off from Chicago, bound for Washington, D.C. As the Boeing 727 reached cruising altitude, the cabin filled with smoke. It was pandemonium. The plane was diverted to Dulles Airport in Virginia. 12 people were treated for smoke inhalation. But for a faulty wire in the bomb, over 100 people would have been killed. Bombing an airliner is a federal offense. The FBI was called in. FBI agent Chris Ronay examined the evidence of the airline bomb.
It essentially was a wooden box that looked to be fashioned, handmade. We found that it contained a barometric switch and some other initiating components, batteries, wires, and a container for the explosive charge. The barometric switch would function when the pressure changed in the baggage compartment sufficiently to close the switch or allow the barometric switch to function and then actually detonate the bomb.
The use of an altitude-sensitive barometric switch told the FBI that they were dealing with a serious and smart bomber. Ronay began his inquiries with the Chicago police. He was looking for anything to compare to the airline device. At Northwestern University, a thorough search uncovered the existence of 2 minor and seemingly unrelated incidents at the university. In addition to learning of the device that injured Terry Marker, Ronay learned of another. On May 9th, 1979, another bomb had gone off at Northwestern University, seriously injuring graduate student John Harris. Its design was nearly identical to the first one. But since they were both relatively minor incidents, authorities at the time didn't connect the two. Dismissing those devices as amateurish pranks, the recovered debris was discarded. Working only from photographs, Chris Ronay concluded that all 3 bombs were the work of the same person.
There were construction techniques, the way the wood was cut, the way it was put together, the markings on the wood, the way the tape was applied, that is evident in the photographs, was the same as in the previous cases.
The pipe bombs, placed inside wooden boxes, were all made of ordinary components: screws and nails and smokeless powder and black tape. The components were homemade and sanded to render them untraceable.
Certain components were not crafted as much as fondled and played with and looked at, and you could see they were handled and shaped and reshaped. And it just struck me that somebody spent an awful lot of time on this bomb enjoying putting it together.
The FBI realized they were dealing with a serial bomber, one that was passionate about his craft. In the 1950s, a shy, highly intelligent boy from suburban Illinois named Ted Kaczynski skipped a grade in elementary school. He was an introvert, preferring to withdraw into his room to study, especially to study chemistry. He was a prodigy with genius-level intelligence. His IQ topped 170. He entered Harvard at 16 and graduated in 3 years in 1962. In 5 years, he had received his doctorate from the University of Michigan. As an assistant professor of mathematics at the University of California, Berkeley, Kaczynski was not a popular or outgoing professor. Practically no one got to know him. In 1969, he abruptly resigned. The social nature of his teaching position was too much for Ted. He just didn't seem to fit in. By 1971, Kaczynski had decided to drop out of society completely. He bought an 1.5 acres of land in a rural area just outside of Lincoln, Montana, 6,000 feet above the society he had come to despise. He built a tiny 8 by 10 foot cabin with no electricity or running water. There he would sit by himself, reading and writing. One of the things Ted wrote was a 23-page essay raging against modern man's obsession with technological and scientific progress. Scientific research, he wrote, will inevitably result in the extinction of individual liberty. He sent a copy to his brother David. David read it and stuck it in a trunk where it sat for 1/4 century. In June of 1978, Ted Kaczynski took a time out from his cabin to take a job working for his brother at a foam cutting plant in Illinois. Ted's bizarre behavior became too much. His brother was forced to fire him.
Ted, take it down.
Ted had insulted a female co-worker who had refused his advances. Ted seethed and within a year moved back to his cabin in Montana, vowing never to see his family again. Trying to fit in as a social being was too frustrating for the introverted genius. Ted withdrew even more, believing modern man incapable of understanding him. He was starting to see civil society as an obstacle that needed to be overcome. In time, Ted became acclimated to his life with few luxuries. He took it upon himself to grow his own food and to be otherwise self-sufficient. He had few acquaintances, opting for his own company in the Montana wilds. Ted rarely made it into Lincoln. When he did, it was usually to bury his face in reference books in the small-town library. On May 3, 1980, Ted Kaczynski rode his homemade bike into Lincoln. He wasn't going to the library this time. Instead, he caught a bus for Helena and checked into the Helena Park Hotel for a brief stay. The next day, he headed west. Ted had urgent business that needed tending to. Percy Wood, the president of United Airlines, received a parcel at his suburban Chicago home on June 10, 1980. A few days earlier, he received a letter from a stranger promising to mail him a book which, the letter said, had tremendous social significance. Wood placed the package on his kitchen counter. He opened and retrieved a book, Ice Brothers by Sloan Wilson. Wood was puzzled. Why is this book socially significant? He opened the cover. Wood was nearly killed. The bomber had upped the ante considerably with his fourth and most powerful device yet. FBI and ATF bomb technicians poured over the scene. It was quickly identified as the work of the serial bomber. Each bomb so far had been a pipe bomb with similar construction and wiring. On this, the fourth bomb, the bomber had left a calling card. Punched into a piece of rubble were the letters FC.
Certainly, the initials FC were put in these bombs to be found, clearly protected in such a way that they would survive the blasts. It didn't make any sense to have it in there. It didn't function in any way. It served no purpose except to say, here's my signature, here's an identifying feature.
The FBI could only speculate what FC meant. By this time, FBI investigators had already given him a name. He bombed universities and airlines. They called him Unabomb, UN for university and A for airline. Naming him was easy. Finding him would be much, much more difficult. In 1981, with FC their best clue yet, the FBI cross-referenced thousands of people with those initials. But the Unabomber was not sitting idle. In October, a package was found sitting in a building at the University of Utah. It was a pipe bomb. Fortunately, it was a dud. Investigators now had a device intact. Perhaps a component was traceable. It would take time to find out. The Unabomber remained busy. In the spring of 1982, a package meant for Professor Leroy Wood Berenson blew up instead in the hands of an academic assistant at Vanderbilt University. The bomb was made of the usual materials, with the initials FC on the surviving wreckage. Examiners spent endless hours studying every minute detail of the Unabomb devices. The most bizarre clues suddenly emerged. The last two people specifically targeted were named Wood.
Wood played such an important role in every one of the bombs. I mean, it was present in every one of the bombs, even when it didn't need to be. He, in fact, if he didn't have wood in it, he threw wood in it, sticks of wood, just so they'd be there. There were references to wood in addresses and names of people throughout.
FBI lab examiner Doug Diedrich of the Trace Evidence Unit is also a wood expert.
Well, the materials may indicate something about that individual. May indicate, for example, that he was a smoker, that he was a drinker, that he was a gambler, that he was a drug user. where he might live, what he might do for a living. And that's one of the things that I was involved with, especially in trying to determine where these types of woods came from, what geographical area, what part of the country.
This approach seemed like a long shot, but the scarcity of clues left investigators with few options. As the FBI investigation intensified, so did the power of the Unabomber's devices. On July 2nd, 1982, Professor Diogenes Angelakos of the University of California, Berkeley, a devoted husband and a popular teacher, noticed a strange-looking object on the floor of the Computer Science Department's coffee room. The explosion seriously wounded him and tore off his fingers. As he lay dazed, he found a typewritten note. "Woo, it works. I told you it would. RV." The FBI ran down everyone in America named Wu, and everyone with the initials RV, a monumental, labor-intensive task, but to no avail.
This is the problem, right?
The note was a
She
ruse.
said she's going to have to do it over again. It's going to take how long?
Another lead surfaced the day following the blast. A custodian who worked in Corey Hall, the building where the bomb exploded, saw a man with a thin mustache and sweatshirt loitering in the hall the night before. The custodian, however, was unable to remember enough details to help a sketch artist make a composite. Angelakos was critically wounded, requiring a lengthy hospital stay. He was no longer able to care for his invalid wife. She died within a month of the blast. In May of 1985, in that same building, Berkeley graduate student John Hauser, a captain in the Air Force, noticed on the floor a 3-ring binder sitting on top of another object. Hauser had just applied for astronaut training. What he didn't know as he lay wounded was that he had already been accepted into the program. But he would never fly again. His Air Force Academy ring was found embedded in the wall across the room. Ironically, Professor Angelakos was nearby when the bomb exploded. He rushed to help Hauser. Unabomber-related crime scene investigations conducted by the FBI, ATF, and the United States Postal Service had become frustratingly routine. The recovered bomb components were packaged and sent to the FBI lab for future comparisons. Over the next few years, there would be many such examinations. On May 8, 1985, a package was received at the Boeing Corporation in Auburn, Washington. It was addressed only to the company, was heavy, and had too much postage.
Hey, Mark, look at this.
A suspicious mailroom employee called security. The package was x-rayed and shown to contain a pipe bomb. It had FC stamped into the end caps. Had the employee opened the package, it most likely would have killed him and anyone else nearby. On November 15, 1985, Dr. James McConnell, a psychology professor at the University of Michigan, received a letter and package from a Ralph C. Kloppenberg. The sender described himself as a doctoral student. "I'd like you to read this book," he wrote. "Everyone in your position should read this book." As he read, his assistant opened the package nearby. The explosion seriously injured the assistant and blew out the hearing of Dr. McConnell. Examiners continued to dissect the bombs. They were evolving as the Unabomber refined his craft. Exhaustive lab tests showed they were getting more sophisticated and more powerful. Agents were frustrated. They were making little progress in determining the identity of the Unabomber. And their analysis was confirming what they already knew. If the packages kept coming, it would only be a matter of time before someone was killed. Hugh Scruton owned the Rentec computer store in Sacramento, California. On December 11, 1985, about lunchtime, Scruton headed out the back door that led to the rear parking lot when he noticed something. It looked like a block of wood with 4 nails sticking out, points up. The explosion was ferocious, blowing a massive gaping hole into Scruton's chest, exposing his heart. The Unabomber was now a murderer. The bomb that killed Hugh Scruton was the most powerful yet. It consisted of a pipe within a pipe and contained all of the same characteristics as the others, right down to the FC stamped on a surviving end cap. The Unabomber investigation was now officially a homicide case. Investigators stuck to their strategy of keeping the details of the case secret, lest the Unabomber learn what they knew, or worse, lest they encourage copycats. Agents were desperate for a solid lead. Ted Kaczynski was always active in his secluded cabin. When he wasn't making bombs, he was writing his philosophy that justified them. For Ted Kaczynski, technological society was a horror, defined by the Earth's destruction and human beings amounting to little more than mindless robots. In Ted's story, anyone who was participating in the human race's dependency on technology was a villain. On February 20th, 1987, a secretary at Cam's computer store in Salt Lake City looked out of her office window and caught a glimpse of a man in the parking lot, placing an object on the ground. An hour later, the store's owner, Gary Wright, was in the parking lot. He noticed the object on the ground. It was a block of wood with 4 nails sticking out, points up. Wright received serious injuries, but miraculously survived. As police scoured bus stations and local businesses looking for a suspect, a sketch was commissioned from the secretary's description. It was unquestionably the portrait of a man in disguise. The sketch didn't catch the Unabomber, but in one way it may have worked. Knowing he was seen, the Unabomber seemed to vanish. After 9 years of bombings, Unabomber-related incidents simply stopped after the 1987 Cams explosion. The investigation had continued, but all available leads had been exhausted. After 6 years of silence, investigators were hopeful that the Unabomber had either been imprisoned on some unrelated charge or died. Either way, the bombs had stopped. But Ted Kaczynski was neither dead nor in jail. He had spent the last 6 years virtually alone, content in his day-to-day routine, tending the garden, hunting, writing, and visiting the library. Ted always managed to stay on top of current events. In 1993, after a 6-year hiatus, several highly publicized events propelled the Unabomber out of retirement. The fiery siege at Waco, Texas, between the ATF and the Branch Davidian religious cult, and the bombing of the World Trade Center created a violent political environment. The Unabomber would return in a fit of violence of his own. Dr. Charles Epstein is a renowned geneticist at the University of San Francisco. On June 22, 1993, he sat down at his kitchen table to open his mail, including a padded envelope which had arrived that day. The blast critically injured Dr. Epstein. After 2.5 hours of surgery, he was stabilized and very lucky to be alive. Two days later, on June 24th, Dr. David Galernter, a prominent computer scientist at Yale University, arrived early at his office to open his mail from the previous day. Injured in his right arm, eye, and abdomen, Galernter struggled to his feet and went out the door for help. The FBI quickly determined that the Epstein bomb and the Galernter bomb were identical. Pipe bombs filled with potassium chlorate and aluminum powder. Both devices had been placed inside a handcrafted wooden box. A few hours after the Galernter bomb went off, a letter was received in the mailroom of the New York Times. It was from a self-proclaimed anarchist group called FC, who were claiming responsibility for the recent bombings. FC promised more communications in the future. An identifying number was provided to the Times to ensure the authenticity of future communications. It was 553-25-4394. The FBI determined that the number was a Social Security number of a 20-year-old parolee in Northern California, incredibly with a tattoo on his arm reading "Pure Wood." An investigation quickly dismissed him as the Unabomber. Another major clue was discovered. Impressed into the paper on the New York Times letter was the faint notation, "Call Nathan R., Wednesday, 7 p.m." The elusive Unabomber finally provided agents with a solid lead. The FBI talked to over 10,000 people whose first name was Nathan and whose last name began with R. The exhaustive search turned up nothing. It seemed the Unabomber loved sending the FBI on wild goose chases. The Times ran the letter, which sparked public interest. It also drew the FBI into dozens of false leads. Disgruntled students, aircraft engineers, even a Dungeons and Dragons club in Chicago. The latest round of activity had sent the FBI investigation into overdrive. A Unabomb task force consisting of FBI, ATF, and postal inspectors was formed to coordinate investigative efforts. Jim Freeman was the head of the FBI's San Francisco field office. He would also head the multi-agency Unabomb task force.
We had evidence that was scattered around 3 different federal agencies and a lot of local state laboratories. So we recognized that our task was to gain control of the information that was already out there, determine what investigation had already been done. And we set about this by deciding to reinvestigate every Unabomb crime.
Every shred of physical evidence that remained from past Unabomber devices would be given to one forensic examiner. Special Agent Tom Monell of the FBI Laboratories Materials and Devices Unit became the chief examiner for the investigation.
All the evidence in the Unabomb case, no matter if it was explosive related or not, came through me and my unit. In a serial bombing type case such as the Unabomb case, the most frustrating aspect was the fact that we were doing all forensic examinations that could possibly be done to the evidence, and it wasn't able to lead us to any individual.
While the task force struggled, Kaczynski's warped revolution against society continued. On December 10, 1994, advertising executive Thomas Moser was opening his mail in his North Caldwell, New Jersey home. His wife and 2 daughters were upstairs. He examined a small package with excessive postage from an H.C. Wickel, Department of Economics, San Francisco State University. The explosion was the most gruesome yet, instantly decapitating Thomas Moser. With every previous device in the Unabomber investigation, Agent Monell was able to reconstruct a replica, working only from the debris recovered from the various crime scenes.
Signature of the Unabomber.
As with the 15 bombs he had reconstructed, this one was unquestionably the work of the Unabomber. A few months later, Ted Kaczynski prepared for an extended visit to the West Coast. This trip would be his busiest to date. On April 19, 1995, Ted Kaczynski was in the San Francisco Bay Area when Timothy McVeigh's 2,000-pound fuel oil bomb destroyed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. Ted would not let his agenda be eclipsed by the devastation in Oklahoma. The next day, April 20th, the nation still reeling over Oklahoma City, Kaczynski mailed 5 items, 4 letters, and a parcel. Within a few days, the mail arrived back east. First was a letter to the New York Times. FBI Special Agent Terry Turchie was second in command of the Unabomb Task Force.
In the letter to the New York Times, he mentioned that he was claiming responsibility for the attacks on Thomas Moser, Charles Epstein, and David Gelernter. He also mentioned some of his goals and objectives and said that he was thinking of sending a manuscript or essay and that he wanted them to consider publishing that essay. And if they did, he would make an agreement to cease committing terrorist acts.
The second letter received was to recent victim David Gelernter at Yale, still recovering from his April wounding. The letter was taunting. Dr. Gelernter, people with advanced degrees are not as smart as they think they are. If you'd had any brains, you would have realized that there are a lot of people out there who resent bitterly the way techno-nerds like you are changing the world. On April 25, 1995, a package arrived at the California Forestry Association addressed to its former president, William Dennison. Its current president, Gilbert Murray, decided to open it himself. It exploded with incredible violence, destroying everything in the office. Gil Murray was literally blown to pieces. 4 blocks away, the governor of California heard the blast from his office. The Unabomb scare was nationwide. Bomb threats were being reported everywhere. The FBI suspect list topped 50,000 names. 16 years and 16 bombs later, the Unabomber had claimed 3 lives and injured 24 people. 2 months after Murray was brutally killed, a letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. It read, "The terrorist group FC, called Unabomb by the FBI, is planning to blow up an airliner out of Los Angeles International Airport during the next 6 days."
The threat had to be taken absolutely seriously because the Unabomber had in fact placed a bomb aboard an aircraft before. It wasn't lethal enough to blow the plane out of the sky, but we knew that his bomb-making ability had progressed enough that he certainly was capable of that now.
The FBI saw to it that special security measures went into effect immediately at California airports. No one without a ticket was allowed through security. All bags were searched. Bomb-sniffing dogs checked everything. The Postal Service stopped flying the mail on commercial jets.
Passengers are questioned about carry-on luggage that they've had. Have you had this package in your custody and control during the entire time? Did you pack the suitcase yourself? Those type of questions all began from that day in LAX.
The same day that the airliner threat was received at the San Francisco Chronicle, the Washington Post received a message from FC, a 56-page typed manifesto. The New York Times received a carbon copy of the manifesto the next day, as did the adult magazine Penthouse 2 days after that. The letter to the Post and Times laid out the terms and conditions for publication and agreed to stop the bombings if the Post or the Times published. For Special Agent Terry Turchi and the Unabomb Task Force, receiving the manifesto was a huge break.
Of course, when the Unabomb manuscript came in, that was big information, and this was a major break, and we all knew that it was a major break, which if handled properly, could possibly lead us to identify the Unabomber.
The manuscript, blandly titled Industrial Society and Its Consequences, was a meticulously written tract against technology, genetics, leftism, conservatism, and modern society generally. The FBI had many items of evidence collected from years of investigating this case. They needed to generate just one solid lead, one that could hopefully break the case wide open. Freeman thought the answer lay in publishing the manifesto.
We very much were in favor of publishing it because after reading the manifesto, it was clear that someone had put their philosophy that had evolved over a number of years within the pages of this thing. It was recognizable. Somebody in reading this, we hoped, would read it and say, I remember that guy. He was sat next to me in class at such and such a university.
After some public soul-searching and discussions with the director of the FBI and Attorney General Janet Reno, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, the decision was made to publish the manifesto. The manifesto appeared in a special section of the Post on September 19, 1995. By early 1996, Ted Kaczynski's brother David had been doing some soul-searching of his own. The news reports that the Unabomber had connections to Chicago, their boyhood home, as well as to Berkeley and Salt Lake City, nagged at him. He got a copy of the manifesto and began reading. He read it in the hopes of erasing the idea that his brother was a killer. What he read sent chills down his spine. He recognized the language and content of the manifesto as being similar to that of writings by his brother Ted. David dug up as many old letters and writings of Ted's as he could find and compared them to the Unabomber manifesto. Both had employed the unique phrase, cool-headed logician. David was distressed, but not yet convinced. He wrote Ted an urgent letter. Though he did not reveal his suspicions, he requested a visit to Montana. Ted refused his brother's request. David decided to call a private investigator to look into the matter, but the news that the private eye brought him was not encouraging. The private eye submitted the manifesto along with some of Ted's writing to be analyzed by experts who didn't know the parties involved. The experts concluded that the authors had a strong chance of being the same person. Frantically, David continued his search for anything Ted had ever written to him. In an old trunk, he came across the essay Ted had sent him back in 1971. David could no longer hide from the reality that his brother might be the Unabomber. David Kaczynski was stunned. The 1971 essay David had unearthed was eerily similar to the Unabomber manifesto. Torn by the prospect of turning in his own brother on the one hand and endangering lives on the other, David Kaczynski made a gut-wrenching decision. Through his attorney, he contacted the FBI about his brother. In February of 1996, David Kaczynski told task force members of his suspicions. He gave a detailed accounting of Ted's life, where he grew up, where he went to school, and where he now lived. He then turned over the 1971 essay.
And then we were able to do a side-by-side comparison between that document that was prepared many years before to the current copy of the manifesto, and it was very clear to us, many of us in the task force, that the similarities were more than coincidental.
The FBI analyzed the essay and found over 160 examples of similarities with the Unabomber manifesto, including common phrases and misspellings. The list went on and on. After 17 years, the FBI had its first major suspect, Ted Kaczynski. Dozens of FBI agents quietly slipped into the small town of Lincoln, Montana. The FBI kept careful surveillance on Kaczynski's cabin as they laid out the case for a search warrant, hoping that the Unabomber would not strike again in the interim. By the beginning of April, enough information had been uncovered to justify the warrant. Among other things, agents were able to learn that Ted had traveled extensively. Hotel records showed that he was always on the move immediately preceding a Unabomber event. Agent Terry Turchi submitted a meticulous 65-page affidavit outlining the government's case against Ted Kaczynski and requesting permission to search his cabin.
We had been working all morning, since about 5 that morning, to pre-position various agent teams in different locations in the woods in Lincoln, Montana, and at a forward command post that we had established in Lincoln. Everybody had a different role. We had also had the evidence response teams coming in, and they were staging at another command post that we had in Lincoln. So everyone was ready to go once the warrant was signed.
Disguised FBI agents and a forest officer approached Kaczynski's cabin. They walked toward his cabin speaking loudly. They didn't want Kaczynski to suspect there was anybody sneaking up on him. The officers asked him to help identify a property line on their map. As he turned to get his coat, the officers pounced on Kaczynski. The suspected Unabomber was in custody. Kaczynski was immediately taken for questioning to a temporary forward command post. Jim Freeman was about to come face to face with the man that had eluded the FBI for nearly 2 decades.
He looked just absolutely disheveled. He looked like he was covered with soot. The agents that had grabbed his arms to restrain him had soot on their hands.
So, Ted, you like to travel?
Kaczynski admitted nothing and refused to say whether the cabin had any live
How about
bombs in
Helena? You
it.
been down there much?
As the questioning continued, the search of the cabin began. The tiny cabin was treated essentially like a live bomb. It was assumed that the place at the very least had live bombs in it, or at worst, was heavily booby-trapped. Explosive ordnance disposal teams cautiously made their way into the cabin. Ted Kaczynski had not been formally arrested on any charges yet. As investigators searched through his cabin, they found enough evidence to charge him with possession of bomb-making materials. They found pipes, chemicals, wiring, batteries, and wooden boxes. This charge would allow agents to hold Kaczynski until a more thorough search could be conducted. FBI Special Agent and explosive expert Donald Sockleben was responsible for quickly gathering evidence in order to obtain the arrest warrant. He rushed to Helena to petition the judge. Sockleben had been working on the Unabomb case for years.
I think it was on the ride back to Helena that night when Pat Webb and I, who had worked on this for so many years, just sort of looked at each other and realized that maybe this was the beginning of the end, that we really did believe that night, if we hadn't believed before, that we had in fact caught the Unabomber.
Ted Kaczynski was detained overnight until formal arrest charges could be brought the following morning. He was led through the streets on national television, looking every bit the part of an eccentric hermit. He was presented the next day before a judge in Helena on a charge of possession of bomb-making equipment. The search of the cabin continued. The room was a gold mine, but a dangerous one. Each container, each book, each binder needed to be x-rayed for explosive devices. It was clearly going to take a long time to search the tiny cabin. The evidence being slowly hauled out of the cabin was damning. A series of 3-ring binders with page after page of detailed bomb designs which matched the bombs used in many of the Unabomb explosions. Explosive powders of the type used in the bombings. Aluminum ingots and aluminum shavings on the floor, crucial bomb components. There was the infamous hooded sweatshirt and sunglasses. Agent Thomas Monell, the expert on Unabomb devices, was also inside the cabin.
The other evidence located in the cabin were electrical components and wire that were consistent with the majority of the Unabomb devices. We found a improvised or a homemade flip type switch that was literally identical to 3 switches that were used in earlier bombs.
After almost 2 full days, the search came to a sudden stop. A package was found. It was wrapped like previous bombs with a return address on it. All it awaited was a victim's name and address for the front. It was x-rayed and determined to be a live pipe bomb. Special Agent Sockleben had to handle the crisis.
Well, from the x-ray, it looked very similar to the last bomb that had been placed, the one that killed Mr. Murray in Sacramento. We were able to safely remove the box from the cabin and take it down the hill to where we set up a site to deal with the bomb.
The search slowly continued in the days ahead, and more damning evidence was seized. In addition to bomb-making paraphernalia and chemicals, agents also seized letters, notes, diagrams, and the Unabomber manifesto. One irrefutable link between Ted Kaczynski and the Unabomber remained: the typewriter used for the manifesto.
The typewriter that had been used to type the manifesto wasn't found until literally the last day of the search, which took 4 or 5 days. It was literally in the bottom of the last box that was opened.
It had taken 11 days to search an 80-square-foot room, but the FBI's careful approach had paid off. The man who had killed, maimed, and ruined lives, all the while taunting the FBI, was caught stone cold. On April 14th, the entire cabin was hoisted onto a flatbed and hauled away for further examination. The charges against Kaczynski had been upgraded. On June 18, 1996, Ted Kaczynski was indicted in Sacramento on 10 counts relating to Unabomber activities. 1 charge in the death of Hugh Scruton, 3 charges in the wounding of Charles Epstein, 3 charges in the maiming of David Galernter, and 3 charges in the death of Gil Murray. That day would have been Gil Murray's 48th birthday. New Jersey authorities filed more charges for the death of Thomas Moser. On November 12, 1996, selected visitors filed into a Sacramento courtroom for the long-awaited trial of Ted Kaczynski. In the front row was Ted's family, brother David, and his mother, Wanda Kaczynski. As Ted entered the courtroom, he turned his back angrily on his family members and never acknowledged them. Opening statements were about to begin when Kaczynski stood up and said he wanted to change lawyers. After a few days, the judge ruled that Kaczynski would have to undergo psychological testing. Federal prison psychiatrist Dr. Sally Johnson spent many days with Kaczynski. She concluded that Ted Kaczynski was mentally ill, but was competent to stand trial. The government's case against Kaczynski was overwhelming. For 17 years, the FBI had prepared for this day. examiners had reconstructed and preserved every device related to the Unabomber's crimes. With Ted Kaczynski's arrest, they were now able to establish an irrefutable link between him and the Unabomber. Ted's desire for solitude would no longer be self-imposed. With no options, he pled guilty to all Unabomber-related crimes. He was given 4 life sentences plus 30 years. He would never be eligible for parole. For Agent Terry Turchi, the Unabomber investigation shows the FBI's determination to never quit until justice is served, no matter how long it takes.
For the people committing these crimes, who may go on for many years and not get caught, they may become more arrogant, or they may become more complacent, or they may think we're never going to catch them. But I think for them and for the public, the message has to be that we don't give up and that we're going to stay with it until we solve it. And certainly I think that is what we're called upon to do and what we need to do.
In June 1998, Joanna Lee, an assistant editor at Simon & Schuster Publishing, received a letter from Ted Kaczynski with a prison return address. She knew he was the convicted Unabomber, but opened it anyway. Kaczynski wanted them to publish a book about his struggle. To this date, there are no takers. One World Trade Center, New York City. Friday, February 26, 1993. The basement garage was a scene of utter destruction, cloaked in thickening smoke. A woman alone, trapped and bleeding, called police. There were many panicked calls to the NYPD that day as real life took on the trappings of a disaster movie.
Terrorist bombings are what happen in other countries, not here in the United States. And yet, in 1993, it happened in New York City. The World Trade Center bombing rattled our notion of domestic security. It shook the foundation of our belief that we're not vulnerable to terrorism. The cracks it caused in our self-confidence can never be repaired. If it happened once, could it happen again? It was the question in everyone's mind, but no one dared to say it aloud. I'm Jim Kellstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. Somewhere in a crater, 5 stories deep, in wreckage a block wide, lay the key to the bomber's identity. At least, that's what investigators hoped.
At 12:18 p.m. on February 26, 1993, panic and confusion gripped the 110-story World Trade Center Tower 1. People were trapped in elevators. Lights went out. Smoke turned the hallways black. Thousands of the injured and panicked occupants choked as they tried blindly to escape what seemed like a nightmare. The engineer who designed the towers anticipated several potential disasters. He structurally designed them to withstand the violence of a sustained hurricane and something as unimaginable as the impact of a fully fueled jet.
Let's go!
It seemed that something had been overlooked, but no one knew what. On that day, Tower 1 became the city's tallest chimney. The stairwells acted as flues, drawing smoke up from the basement, blackening every floor. In the first chaotic hours, all officials knew for sure was that the cause of the problem was in the basement garage. Neil Herman, supervisor of the Joint Terrorist Task Force at the FBI's New York office, was just blocks away from the Trade Center. Unaware of the cause of the mayhem, the FBI took it upon themselves to respond.
Initially, we felt, and we were told, that it was possibly a fire or transformer. Within a few minutes, it became apparent from the traffic on the police channels that there was something there more than just a fire or some kind of an accident. And I dispatched, along with myself, members of the Joint Terrorism Task Force down to the World Trade Center.
The immediate concern was getting the trapped victims out of the building. Extensive damage created logistical problems for rescue workers. Many of those inside struggled to make their own way to safety. The elevators had broken down, and those on the top floor had to walk down 110 flights. There were tremendous injuries due to smoke inhalation. As hundreds of emergency personnel continued their rescue efforts, FBI agents dispatched to the Trade Center were scouring the area for any indication of what may have caused the devastation. The destruction was massive. The city streets around the complex were buckling. The Vista Hotel, which rests between the two towers, had sustained tremendous amounts of damage. It was immediately apparent to investigators that whatever occurred below the street level was powerful enough to come up through 4 levels of the parking garage, up to the street and higher. Special Agent Chuck Stern of the FBI's counterterrorism branch began the process of organizing the investigation.
It started to look like it might be an explosion, a criminal explosion. I would say maybe within an hour of the blast. And then, of course, more and more information kept coming back. You know, we had our special agent bomb technicians from the FBI were down there and, you know, working with the bomb squad from the city police department, and you know, they were reaching the same conclusion that, you know, this is what it appeared to be.
By early that evening, 200 agents and lab personnel from the explosives unit at FBI headquarters were flown in to assist the hundreds of ATF and NYPD bomb squad technicians already at the scene. Locating survivors and getting them out was the only concern. The rescue effort was largely focused in the garage area. As they slowly made their way through the wreckage, rescue workers were shocked and relieved to find survivors. As they moved onward, they reached an area that had sustained massive destruction. FBI, ATF, and NYPD bomb technicians had suited up in protective gear to aid in the search. Some carried thermal imaging cameras to scan for bodies trapped in the rubble. The discoveries became more gruesome. 6 people had been found dead. Among the dead was John DiGiovanni, a dental supply salesman who had parked his car in the underground lot. Robert Kirkpatrick, William Mako, Stephen Knapp, and Monica Smith were also killed. They'd worked for a company that provided maintenance to the World Trade Center. Monica was pregnant with her first child. Wilfredo Mercado, an employee last seen unloading a van in the garage, was found dead, buried under 12 feet of concrete. Inside the garage was an apocalyptic scene. Debris and concrete were scattered 100 yards in all directions. Hundreds of cars had been demolished, and small fires erupted from spilled gasoline. Pumps drained a flood of water and sewage from broken pipes. Overhead, 6 tons of concrete clung to warped rebars. Fiber optic cables dangled. To FBI agents, there was no way that the cause of this damage was accidental. Special Agent Chris Ronay from the FBI Laboratories Explosives Unit surveyed the damage.
Well, as we analyzed the damage to the building, even in the early stages, it was clear that there was a very large bomb, a very large explosive device of some hundreds of pounds. It was clear from the beginning. We didn't know how big it was. Placed in the basement on one of the parking garage levels, most likely in a vehicle.
If the agent's initial conclusions were correct, this was the single greatest act of terrorism on American soil at that time. The morning after the explosion, interagency teams prepared for their first extended glimpse of the destruction. In addition to the ongoing search for victims, they were now looking for any clue that could explain the explosion. But they were explicitly instructed not to move any evidence. The structural integrity of the lower levels was severely weakened. Any disturbance might cause what little support there was remaining to collapse on those inside. The floor of the B2 level of the garage had collapsed, sending hundreds of cars from 3 parking levels down several stories. All the vehicles came to rest at the bottom level, crushing the tower's refrigeration room.
Actually, the engineers told us that debris that was piled around the columns, sort of like a soda straw stuck into a pile of sand. And you couldn't remove the debris because that would remove what little support was present and that was holding the Vista Hotel up.
Construction crews spent hours reinforcing the walls and columns in the parking levels so that agents and investigators could safely explore the scene. After several hours, agents and technicians began to make their way into the blast area.
It was very, very eerie because it was deserted and there were a lot of cars with the trunks blown open and things like that. And some of them you could hear ticking because which was kind of an eerie thing at a bomb site, because the turn signals had been activated and were actually still flashing on some of the cars.
Gradually, the searchers got closer to the origin of the blast, known as Ground Zero. The damage was so extensive that there was no conclusive evidence that pointed to the cause of the explosion. The floors were completely blown away, leaving a 5-story crater which extended through the cavity of the building. Investigators searching for explosive residues had difficulty finding them. They were mixed in with concrete debris and building materials. They had to sift through tons of dirt and rubble in the hope of finding some scrap of evidence. Hundreds of damaged vehicles were swabbed and vacuumed in search of residues. Agents persisted. Somewhere in the devastation were answers. As the images of the World Trade Center bombing were broadcast around the nation, people reacted with horror and disbelief. America's innocence had been shattered. The United States joined the list of countries hardened by terrorist attacks. Desperate to catch the bombers, the city placed a bounty on their heads, $200,000, the largest in city history. By Saturday morning, the FBI had set up a command post specifically for this investigation. Every available agent was assigned to the case. They had received hundreds of leads. Most were callers who described suspicious neighbors. Numerous groups had phoned in to claim responsibility. Though most of these leads appeared to be dead ends, they all had to be pursued. Just 2 days after the blast, as agents chased down leads, investigators processing the crime scene spotted a piece of charred, twisted steel at what was thought to be the center of the explosion. It was part of a vehicle decimated by the blast. Perhaps from the vehicle that delivered the bomb.
VIN number here.
Investigators noticed a series of digits stamped onto the metal debris. Though they were explicitly instructed not to remove evidence, they felt their finding was significant enough to override protocol. The metal debris was loaded onto a stretcher and hoisted up to the top of the crater. Once it was on the surface, agents rushed the finding to a forensics laboratory set up by the NYPD crime lab. In the lab, agents and examiners were having difficulty determining what the markings meant. An investigator from the FBI's Joint Autocrime Task Force was called to examine the debris.
I think it's 729.
His analysis would provide the first major break of the investigation. He called Special Agent Stern immediately.
He says, "Chuck, I looked at this and I said to the person who was showing it to me, my man, you don't know what you have here. This is a confidential vehicle identification number."
Confidential VIN numbers are as unique to a particular automobile as fingerprints are to a person. The hidden number allows law enforcement to determine if a particular vehicle has been stolen. It also gives investigators detailed information about the vehicle, including who owns the car. Within 15 minutes, investigators were able to enter the confidential number into the National Crime Information Center computer, which lists all vehicles that have been reported stolen. A response quickly came back. The number belonged to a Ford Econoline van that had been reported stolen from DIB Leasing in Jersey City, New Jersey. The FBI's Newark office was contacted immediately. Within minutes, agents arrived at DIB. The FBI was prepared to uncover everyone or anything that had access to that van.
That this Ford Econoline van was, in fact, a Ryder rental van that had been rented by an individual by the name of Mohammed Salome, and then later reported stolen. And they learned from the management of DIB Leasing that Salome had put down a $400 deposit on the van, and that he had been anxiously trying to get the deposit back.
After conferring with federal prosecutors late into the evening on Wednesday, the decision was made to have an undercover FBI agent in place at DIB when Salome returned for his deposit the next morning. They spent the remainder of the evening piecing together Salome's history. They learned that Mohammed Salome was a 25-year-old immigrant of Palestinian descent. He had come to the attention of authorities as a vocal supporter of Muslim fundamentalist El Said Nosser, whose scathing opposition to the Israeli, Egyptian, and United States governments was no secret. The undercover agent was posing as a Ryder representative, stating to Salome that he needed more information about the theft of the van before refunding the deposit. After some discussion, Salome walked out with the $400. As he stepped out of the office, dozens of FBI agents who had been monitoring their discussion descended upon Salome. Less than 1 week after the bombing, the FBI had a suspect in custody. Salome said little to the agents who questioned him about the bombing. They knew it was probable that he had not acted alone. The investigation was taking on a clearer focus. When Salome was arrested, agents recovered various personal items, including his wallet, which contained several business cards and telephone numbers. They began by searching the address listed on his driver's license. A former roommate told agents that Salome no longer lived at that address. However, they were able to find some belongings of Salome's that he had left behind. There were news clippings and photos relating to Nosair, and a photo of him and Nosair together. There were numerous bank records. There were also more names and numbers for investigators to pursue.
We were able to obtain addresses, we were able to obtain telephone numbers, we were able to have pen registers where we were able to monitor phone calls, calls coming in and going out. And once that started, again, it opened up the floodgates.
Investigators were also receiving help from the public. A few days after Salome's arrest, the manager of the space station storage facility in Jersey City called the FBI. Individuals who rented Unit 4344 had received several deliveries from chemical companies just prior to the Trade Center blast. The manager ordered a key and opened the unit. Inside, he found what he thought to be bomb-making paraphernalia. FBI agents would reach the same conclusion. Inside, investigators found several compounds which could be used for making explosives. Their findings were sent to the FBI lab for analysis. There were also many other leads that emerged from the search of the storage facility. Receipts for the chemicals, bank and phone records, and an unexpected bonus, a log of the suspect's comings and goings. To enter the facility, each tenant was required to punch in their special access code on a keypad located at the entrance. Each time a tenant punched in his number, it was recorded in a computer system. Agents could determine each time Unit 4344 was accessed. Meanwhile, police assembled a lineup. Doug Melvin, manager of the space station, identified Mohammed Salome as the man who rented the locker. He recognized him easily because Salome frequently visited his storage locker. In Melvin's experience, customers usually had no reason to do that. Continuing to search for any possible lead, agents obtained phone records from a payphone just outside the storage facility. One name on the list of individuals who received calls from that phone was already familiar to the FBI. That name was Nidal Ayad. Nidal Ayad's name first appeared on a business card found inside Salome's wallet. Ayad worked as a chemical engineer. Within a week of Salome's arrest, agents learned Ayad had called a chemical company inquiring about buying chemicals. The prospect of another bomb was frighteningly real. It appeared that another act of violence was in the making. Agents felt they had sufficient information to obtain a warrant for Ayad's arrest. On March 10th, the FBI raided his home in New Jersey as he and his family ate dinner. After searching his home, agents quickly made their way to his place of business, Allied Chemical. There they confiscated phone records and bank statements that could tie him to Salome. The most irrefutable link between Ayad and the bomb plot, however, came from Ayad's business computer. It was seized and then thoroughly examined.
Our technical people were able to restore an erased file, which turned out to be a letter claiming credit for the World Trade Center bombing on behalf of an organization known as the Liberation Army 5th Battalion.
A similar letter had been sent to the New York Times 4 days after the explosion. In it, the group called the bombing an act of terrorism to protest American support for Israel. There was also a second letter Ayad hadn't had time to send. It promised another blast. Though the investigation was progressing very quickly, each new discovery revealed the existence of a large and ongoing conspiracy. The potential for more attacks grew more likely every day. As the FBI tried to learn more from their prime suspects in the World Trade Center bombing, Salome and Ayad continued to stonewall their efforts. Analysis of all the confiscated phone records led investigators to an apartment in Jersey City. The landlord who owned the apartment at 40 Pamrapo Avenue confirmed that Salome and another individual rented the apartment from early January of 1993 until the end of February, just 2 months later. The landlord could not confirm the identity of Salome's roommate, whose name he knew only as Rashid. Most likely, that name was an alias. A search warrant was quickly issued. After executing the warrant, agents discovered that 40 Pamrapo Avenue was the bomb factory, the place where the conspirators mixed an explosive powerful enough to rock the World Trade Center. Inside the apartment and an adjacent garage, FBI forensic examiners recovered traces of a diverse range of chemicals. These items were collected and then rushed to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. While agents searched the apartment, the identity of Salome's mysterious roommate emerged. They found papers requesting political asylum in the name of Ramzi Youssef, who, according to the documents, had been detained in September of 1992 at Kennedy Airport for entering the country without a visa. The Pamrapo Avenue apartment was a gold mine for the FBI.
All right, let's go. Go ahead, Taskmaster.
Before they learned of the apartment, the FBI's laboratory examiners could only speculate from residue samples taken at the Trade Center that the bomb used was comprised of the highly explosive compound urea nitrate. The discovery of the bomb factory at Pamrapo Avenue, however, made them certain. From the labs at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., Special Agent Ronay reported the findings.
From the analyses in the laboratory, we concluded that it was made with urea nitrate, a homemade explosive mixture. There's no such commercial product. So they had to mix this themselves. And when we finally located the storehouse or workshop where they did make the bomb, this was confirmed. These materials or remnants of them were available and confirmed that this is what we were indeed seeing in the laboratory in these residues.
Witness interviews and phone record analysis continued, directed mainly at the locations where key elements of the conspiracy had taken place. All of those interviewed mentioned seeing a distinctive-looking individual in the company of Salome and Ramzi Youssef. Phone records helped to identify that individual as Mahmoud Abu Halima. As agents focused their investigation on Abu Halima, they learned that shortly after the bombing, he had fled the country. Abu Halima was well known to authorities through his association with El Said Nosser. Abu Halima was also close to the radical Muslim cleric Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, who would later be sentenced to life in prison for a conspiracy to bomb several New York City landmarks. Soon after agents learned that Abu Halima had fled the country, Egyptian authorities contacted the FBI to say that he'd been arrested and detained in Cairo. Abu Halima had been wanted there for conspiring against Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. Negotiations between the United States and Egyptian governments were successful. Agents flew to Egypt and took Abu Halima into FBI custody. When he was turned over to FBI agents, his hands were cuffed and his head was entirely covered. He told the FBI that he thought he was being taken out to be shot. Relieved to now be in their custody, he spoke to agents on the flight back to New York.
He did make several statements that were used against him at trial. One of the key things that he said was, about Rashid, who was later determined to be an alias used by Ramzi Youssef.
Abu Halima told Stern that he and Youssef had met in Afghanistan at a secret camp for the Mujahideen Muslim freedom fighters. a training ground for international terrorists. At every step of the investigation, Ramzi Youssef's name appeared. He was a known international terrorist and an expert with explosives. Agents now believed he was the mastermind behind the World Trade Center bombing. The FBI began searching for Youssef. They soon learned that he fled the country the night of the Trade Center bombing. An international manhunt for Ramzi Youssef had begun. In the meantime, agents were trying to determine how and when Youssef came to the United States. It's been said that the day Ramzi Youssef arrived on American soil was the day terrorism came to America. On September 1st, 1992, the shadowy Afghan-trained master bomb maker arrived at New York's Kennedy Airport. The FBI's close scrutiny of the passenger manifest from Youssef's flight that day revealed another clue. He had not entered the country alone in September of 1992. With him was Ahmad Ajaj. But Ajaj had been detained by customs agents for producing a false Swedish passport. In Ajaj's suitcase, customs agents found a library of manuals on bomb making and guerrilla warfare. The suitcase was confiscated, and Ajaj was arrested and jailed for passport fraud. To the FBI, Ajaj appeared to be an unlikely conspirator. He had been incarcerated from September of 1992 through the bombing of the Trade Center in February of 1993. Fortunately for agents, prison policy required that all phone conversations be recorded. Ajaj had unwittingly left a trail, and agents quickly followed it.
And we began to see that he was, through various methods, predominantly through three-way calling, where he would call another individual, and then that individual would forward the calls. He was staying in contact with the other conspirators and was in fact trying to assist them in completing their mission of building this bomb.
Ajaj was questioned by FBI agents about his contacts and his knowledge of the bombing. He said little. His silence was not enough to prevent FBI agents from arresting and charging him in connection with the bombing. With 4 conspirators now in custody, authorities decided to bring them to trial while the search for other bombers continued. In September of 1993, 6 months after the bombing of the World Trade Center, Salome, Ayad, Abu Halima, and Ajaj appeared in federal court in New York City.
By the time that the trial started in September of 1993, we really had to have 2 investigations in one. We had to have an investigation basically continuing to identify those responsible, locate those that were also charged that were fugitives, and also prepare for a 6-month trial that ultimately ended in March of 1994.
By this time, examiners had processed numerous crime scenes. The World Trade Center, the storage facility, and the bomb factory. 70% of the van that delivered the bomb had been collected. There was also a mass of receipts, phone records, and interviews. Tons of evidence had been recovered. It would now be up to a jury to determine if it was enough. By September of 1993, 6 months after the bombing, federal prosecutors were ready to present to a jury how the defendants carried out the bombing of the World Trade Center. The conspiracy began soon after Ramzi Youssef arrived in America in September of 1992. He moved in with Salome, and the two became close friends. The friendship was founded on a mutual hatred of Israel and a desire to disrupt U.S. support of the Israeli government. They chose the World Trade Center as the stage for articulating their political agenda. The World Trade Towers are the city's tallest buildings, rising a quarter-mile above the pavement. In addition to the two towers, the complex includes the Vista Hotel, numerous underground shopping areas, and entrances to the subway lines that connect New York and New Jersey. Below that are 5 parking levels, each level containing more offices and businesses. The terrorists decided the bomb could cause the most damage, claim the most lives, by being placed in the garage. The plan was put into effect. Receipts showed that in November, Yosef used an alias to buy chemicals. Throughout the winter, he would order more as he honed the formula for his bomb and worked out the plan of attack.
Where are the exits?
The chemicals were delivered to space station storage. Salome or Yosef would sign for them, using aliases to make sure that no paper trail could lead to them. Yosef was desperate for the bomb-making manuals and Ajaj's confiscated luggage. Yosef developed a clever 3-way calling system to hide the trail from Ajaj's prison phone in New York City to his New Jersey apartment. First, Yosef called a burger stand in Dallas, Texas, where his friend Iyad Ishmael worked. Then Ishmael called Ajaj as Yosef waited on the other line.
Get them here. No. Look.
When Ajaj answered the phone in prison,
Everything
Ishmael
is
connected him with Yosef.
Ajad, how are you doing?
Together, the three were able to discuss the bomb's construction.
I don't have the plans.
The jury was methodically being shown the lengths to which the bombers had gone to protect themselves. These bombers would not be deterred. The prosecutors continued. One winter afternoon, the bombers' plot stalled. Salome and Yosef were driving back from Abu Halima's New Jersey home when Salome lost control of his car. He suffered only minor injuries. Yosef was more seriously hurt. He was hospitalized for a week. Yosef made calls to chemical companies from his hospital bed. The FBI learned who he called and when through hospital phone records. As Yosef recuperated, Salome, Iyad, and Abu Halima drove deep into the Pennsylvania woods. Here they tested a prototype of their deadly mixture. It exploded, but it needed more power. So in the coming days, Iyad would attempt to buy compressed hydrogen gas. Hydrogen is so commonly used in Middle Eastern terrorist bombings that it's considered a signature. Even though Iyad worked as a chemical engineer, he had problems finding a company that would sell it to him. On February 16th, the chemist Iyad rented a car to scout the World Trade Center. Salome's fingerprints on the wheel revealed that he drove. His prints were also on the parking ticket for the garage's B2 level. A sketch found later showed Iyad had made a rough drawing of the floor plan. Then, just 4 days before the bombing, at Yosef's request, Iyad Ishmael arrived in New York from Dallas to help complete the bomb making. Ishmael would also drive the vehicle carrying the bomb into the garage. He was Yosef's trusted friend, and he had been a New York City cab driver. Perfect credentials for this delicate operation. On February 23rd, Salome went to DIB Leasing and rented a 10-foot Ford Econoline panel van. He left a cash deposit of $400. Construction of the bomb was nearly complete. There was one more reconnaissance visit to the World Trade Center garage. In a burgundy Chevy Corsica rented by Ayala, with Salome listed as the second driver, the conspirators returned to the garage with Yosef and Ishmael to determine the precise location for placing the bomb. Jurors were shown another garage claim ticket that confirmed the time of the visit, the make of the car, and the garage level they parked on, the B2 level. Meanwhile, Ayad had managed to reach a firm that would sell him compressed hydrogen. He ordered 3 large tanks, which were delivered to the space station storage the next day. On February 25th at the Pamrapo apartment, Abu Halima and the others carefully mixed sulfuric and nitric acid with glycerin into the deadly and volatile substance nitroglycerin. They mixed an estimated 1,200 pounds of urea crystals with several gallons of nitric acid. They poured it into big metal drums where it formed a gel-like mass. They transferred the urea nitrate mass into plastic trash cans. The others had backed the van down the driveway behind the house and up to the apartment door. They packed the cargo hold with their creation, a lethal cocktail of chemicals, bonding agent, fuse, and detonator. They loaded the trash cans and then arranged the home-brewed nitroglycerin among them. They had threaded 4 long fuses through surgical tubing to reduce the smoke and slow the burn enough for the bombers to escape. The fuses were rigged to blasting caps and boxes of gunpowder, and then inserted into each of the nitro containers. All that was missing was the hydrogen, which was used to make the blast even more devastating. In the Ryder van, followed by Ayad's Corsica, they drove to the space station to pick up the hydrogen. They loaded it carefully in the van, propping the 3 red tanks behind the boxes of nitro against the rear doors. Yosef and Ishmael drove the van from New Jersey to a hotel in Manhattan. Hotel records showed that Ishmael had reserved a room for the night on February 25th. They parked it out back for the night, hidden from view. At 10 that evening, from his home in Jersey City, Salome informed New Jersey police that the van had been stolen. He spun a story about parking it at a grocery store and coming out to find it gone. Later that night, he met with police to document the loss. He knew he would need a valid police report if he was going to get his deposit back. Agents learned that Salome had purchased a child's airline ticket abroad because it was all he could afford. He needed the van deposit back so he could upgrade the ticket to an adult fare. With the vehicle having been reported stolen, everything was in place. The bombers took their last drive to the World Trade Center. At about 2 minutes past noon the next day, Friday, February 26, 1993, the bombers' Ryder van pulled into the B2 level ramp of the World Trade Center. The burgundy Corsica followed. Ishmael drove the van as Yosef sat in the passenger seat. the van into a space normally occupied by a New York Port Authority van. Since Port Authority owns the World Trade Center, their vehicles have easy access in and out of the garage. The getaway car waited nearby. One of the men held a cigarette lighter against the fuse. As it began to burn, they rushed to the Corsica and pulled away. The flames raced along, an inch every 2.5 seconds, silent and almost smoke-free because of the surgical tubing. The gunpowder was packed into Atlas Rockmaster blasting caps, the kind used in the demolition of large building sites. 4 fuses were used to guarantee the bomb would detonate. Yosef, Ishmael, and the others exited the garage a few seconds before the blast. At 12:18 p.m., the months of planning this destruction was about to become a reality. The explosion hit the wall of the tower with a massive force, destroying everything around it. Later that day, as rescue workers and investigators were still responding to the scene, Yosef sat safely aboard an airplane to Pakistan, and Ishmael aboard a plane to Jordan. Within days, Abu Halima had also fled. If investigators had not found and tracked the VIN number so quickly, Salome would likely have escaped too. Over the course of the 6-month trial, the jury heard from 206 witnesses and reviewed a total of 10,000 pages of testimony. In February of 1994, a year after the bombing, the trial concluded. It took the jury just 3 days to reach a verdict. The jury forewoman read off 38 pronouncements of guilty: conspiracy, explosive destruction of property, interstate transportation of explosives, and murder. When she finished, the courtroom erupted. Ayad and Salome leapt up, screaming the verdict was an injustice. Only Abu Halima had remained silent. He sat calmly, arms folded, with a bemused smile on his face. 3 months after their convictions, on May 24, 1994, Judge Kevin Duffy sentenced each bomber to a year in prison for each year of life he had deprived the victims. It came to 240 years apiece, with no possibility of parole. Sentencing went on for hours, with each defendant making a lengthy speech. Mohammed Salome, the chemist Nidal Ayad, Ahmed Ajaj, the man who brought the bomb manuals into the country, and Mahmoud Abu Halima, known as the Red, will spend the rest of their lives in prison. Though the trial of the 4 defendants was a success, the mastermind Ramzi Yosef and his accomplice Iyad Ishmael were still fugitives. 4 of the 6 conspirators in the World Trade Center bombing had been convicted. But the FBI still sought the mastermind of the bombing. As the search for Ramzi Yosef and his accomplice Iyad Ishmael continued, agents learned that Yosef was involved in several terrorist plots designed to bring down commercial airliners worldwide. Advisories were issued to American travelers abroad. More terrorist attacks on Americans or American interests were likely following the verdict. Yosef was one of the most dangerous and elusive men in the world.
Subsequent to the World Trade Center incident, it's obvious and apparent that he was planning additional acts of terrorism around the world. The air conspiracy case certainly reveals that the extent of what was being planned, the fact that he was moving around throughout the world, several countries, indicates a wide range of support that he and his compatriots had.
It was not until February of 1995, 2 years after the Trade Center bomb went off, that Ramzi Yousef was apprehended in Pakistan and turned over to FBI agents. Agent Stern was sent to retrieve Yousef and bring him back. Yousef was suddenly willing to talk. His hatred for the United States and its aid to Israel was all-consuming. He told Stern that the World Trade Center was chosen as his target because it was the greatest symbol of American finance and imperialism.
He felt that it was kind of like a state of war. He compared it to the United States atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You know, what he said, 250,000 people were killed, and he felt that if he could topple one of the towers into the other, he would kill that many people, and it was a similar type act.
The final arrest came 6 months later, in June of 1995. Iyad Ishmael was discovered and apprehended in Jordan. He too was returned to the United States to stand trial for his role in the bombing. Yousef and Ishmael were tried together in New York City. In January of 1998, after being found guilty of the same 38 charges that the other defendants had faced, a judge sentenced the two to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The judge, calling Yousef an apostle of evil, ruled that Yousef should serve the remainder of his life in solitary confinement. Only a life of solitude could prevent Yousef from conspiring to kill again. With the major conspirators imprisoned for life, the FBI and other law enforcement agencies have had a chance to reflect on the magnitude of this investigation.
Well, the World Trade Center case really, in many ways, was a real wake-up call for law enforcement. It was the largest single act of international terrorism in the country. And although terrorism has been here for many years, certainly on the scope that we saw the World Trade Center was something that was unique and certainly much more horrific than we've seen in the past.
The bombers did $550 million worth of destruction to the World Trade Center. The financial damage caused by the disruption of national and international business was also deeply felt. America had been jolted from its belief that international terrorist attacks don't happen on American soil. By bringing such a complex and far-reaching conspiracy to a close so quickly, the FBI sent a message around the world. The taking of innocent lives will never be tolerated.